Hello and welcome to the Class 20 video on social biases. This is the last video in our cognitive bias unit, and today we will be looking at social biases, which are biases that affect our ability to communicate across social groups and therefore our ability to think, to do critical thinking cooperatively with members of other social groups. And for this class, we did another reading from the book by Maureen Linker, Intellectual Empathy. So to start with, let's just review what we learned about Linker in the first section of this course. And we're going to start with the concept of intellectual empathy itself. So this is the core concept for Linker's book, and this is how she introduces it. I use the term intellectual empathy for the work we will be doing in this book because it captures the cognitive, affective elements of thinking about identity and social difference. So I mentioned in a previous class that intellectual empathy is a fairly common term in critical thinking, but Linker's approach to it is a little bit distinctive because it unifies both what she says cognitive and affective, and those are just fancy terms for thinking and feeling, right? And often I think the other treatments of intellectual empathy rely too much on the cognitive, the thinking side, and not the affective, the feeling side. And a lot of this, as I said before, is summarized in this tweet that I just found actually really inspiring. If you say you don't allow emotions to influence your thinking, you're saying you have absolutely no awareness of all the ways your emotions influence your thinking. And so I wanted to start saying that in critical thinking, rather than trying to move beyond emotion or trying to overcome emotion, we just want to use the same metacognitive skills we use for our reasoning to our emotion. Apply those same skills to our emotion, right? So the goal isn't to be unemotional. The goal is to be emotionally intelligent. And your emotional intelligence will complement your argumentative intelligence to make you a better critical thinker. All right. So one example of the way intellectual empathy has traditionally been treated comes from the philosopher Richard Paul, who has done a lot to promote, who did a lot in his life to promote the teaching of critical thinking, together with his partner Linda Elder. And so he emphasizes two skills. He emphasizes the ability to charitably reconstruct someone's reasons for belief, that is, understand what their argument is and be kind to them. Don't present them in a maximally unfair way. You want to avoid what we called earlier the straw man fallacy. And you ought to be able and willing to reason from premises you don't agree with. Take up the other person's premises and see what follows from them. So, if you are pro-choice, imagine for a second that you did believe that, well, as the phrase says, life begins at conception. I have a whole other class about why that is a misleading phrase. But the point is that you start with someone else's premises, and maybe even someone else's premises as they understand them. And once you're empathically in that place, you can reason from there. So to this traditional conception of intellectual empathy, Linker adds two ideas. Understanding how someone's beliefs are situated in their web of belief, and understanding their emotional motivations for their belief. So this becomes a bit more well, affective, because you have to understand their emotional motivations, not just their cognitive motivations. Um, and also, you have to think about them more holistically as a person, understand their web of belief and where what you're talking about sits in their web of belief. So I said that for this class, we would use a combined definition of intellectual empathy that brings together the elements of both Richard Paul's definition and Maureen Linker's definition. So broadly, I just say intellectual empathy is the ability to holistically understand the perspective of a person you are reasoning with. And I say holistically there to capture both the cognitive elements that Paul emphasizes and the affective elements that Linker emphasizes. So, intellectual empathy requires charitably reconstructing someone's reasons for belief, being able to reason from premises you don't agree with, understanding how their beliefs are situated in their web of belief, and understanding their emotional motivations for their belief. So I mentioned the technical term web of belief, and so I want to continue my review of Linker by returning to this idea and how it relates to another important idea that we've been discussing, confirmation bias. So we'll start with confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is just the tendency to ignore or discount evidence and arguments that contradict your current beliefs. So a standard example here is how people choose news sources that are slanted toward their current belief. We will talk more about this when we talk about information filtering and echo chambers. That's a standard example. But the confirmation bias is a global phenomenon. It applies to every time you are, it applies to all your perceptions. Everything is filtered in a way that maximizes your um, ability to confirm what you already think is true. The web of belief, on the other hand, was an analogy from the philosopher W.V.O. Quine. He said that our beliefs form like a spider web, and the beliefs are like nodes on the spider web, and then the webs themselves are inferences because there are inferential connections between our beliefs. So all our beliefs are united by an argumentative structure. Um, they're connected by inference. What this means is that if you alter one belief, it is going to have reverberations across the whole web. Beliefs toward the center of our web of belief are harder to revise than beliefs around the edges. And as I said before, beliefs that relate to our self-conception are almost always the most deeply held. And these include beliefs about the identity groups we belong to, things like race and gender. So your idea of what it means to be a man is going to be at the center of your web of belief, in all likelihood, if you identify as male. Confirmation bias relates to the web of belief because confirmation bias works to keep the center of the web of belief strong. Confirmation bias is like a maintenance procedure for your web of belief that ensures that the things that you think are central stay central. And the changes only come, if they have to come at all, at the periphery of your web of belief. Right? So if you get disconfirming evidence, if something unexpected happens to you, you were predicting things go a certain way and they don't, you can try to alter the center of your web of belief, but if you can possibly account for the changes by altering the edges of your web of belief, that's easier on you. Confirmation bias, which has been running along the whole time, it keeps these nodes in your web of belief sorted so that things towards the center stay firm. All right, so that's the review of Linker. For the new content I want to talk about is just the confirmation bias, or I'm sorry, the cognitive biases that Linker discusses that, again, are related to our ability to communicate across social difference and therefore to reason cooperatively, to do critical thinking cooperatively across social difference. So in the reading I gave you for this class, we discussed several cognitive biases. There was the actor-observer bias, in-group bias, group polarization, the outgroup homogeneity effect, status quo bias, false consensus bias, and the hostile media effect. Two of these we've already covered, the status quo bias and the hostile media effect. Let me just review those quick. So status quo bias is just a preference to wanting to keep things the way they are now. And this is actually a global bias that happens to people whether they identify as politically liberal or politically conservative. People actually don't like change for the most part. Change bad. That's my only comment here. And this is intimately related to a lot of the other biases that we had been talking about. Endowment, the endowment effect, and loss aversion are both products of our desire to keep things the same. We would rather have a bad situation that we know how to deal with and have been dealing with than risk a new situation that we might not be able to handle. But in the previous class, I emphasized an intimate connection to another kind of cognitive bias, and this is what's called the just world hypothesis. So the just world hypothesis is simply the belief that, on the whole, life is fair. Things turn out the way they should. And I emphasize this because it is part of the underlying psychology behind victim blaming. There is a weird, broadly held across humanity tendency to say that if something bad happens to someone, they must have done something to deserve it. People like to say that life isn't fair, but that's mostly when they're just talking about other people. and, and whether or not they personally have a duty to treat them fairly. Actually, people do kind of believe that life is fair to the extent that we really hate to think that bad things happen to good people for no reason. And there's some obvious reasons for this, right? I mean, if bad things happen to good people for no reason, then bad things could happen to us for no reason. Often, when bad things happen, we look to blame the victim. And this comes up most prominently, for instance, in sexual assault cases, there's a lot of victim blaming, but it's actually something that happens across the board. People get sick, you say, oh, they must have been living an unhealthy lifestyle. This is a bad way of thinking. It hurts people who are already in trouble. It prevents us from helping people who need to be helped and receiving help in return when we need help. All right. So status quo bias, the just world hypothesis, and victim blaming are intimately related, and they are important cognitive biases to be aware of. The other cognitive bias that's a bit of review for us is the hostile media effect. And this is just the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who believe the media is biased believe that it is biased against them. And, the exact findings of the issue vary. The exact percentages vary with the issue in the country, but the finding is pretty consistent. And I mentioned this early on because it's a kind of cognitive bias that can't easily be explained as a heuristic. It's more just a feature of the way we think about things. So when the media agrees with us, we don't say it's biased in favor of us. We just say it's true. And And so things like this and confirmation bias as well, these are about how we structure our belief system to support our ego and, our ability to function in the world. They aren't a product of heuristics. Okay. So now I want to turn to the kinds of cognitive bias, the new cognitive biases that Linker raises in this chapter. So the first one is actor-observer bias. This is our tendency to feel that our own actions are products of our particular circumstances, while the actions of others are viewed as signs of their basic character. So I got caught in traffic, but you are irresponsible and have no respect for other people's time. So in some ways, this is a fairly familiar idea. It's people just make apologies for themselves and blame others. But there's a specific pattern that's being followed here. It has to do with internal and external causes. My actions were determined by things outside my control, things outside of me. Your actions come from your character. I'll return to this. But Linker gives a quote that I think is good. And she quotes a lot from online debates, and I think this is a good thing to do because again, if there's one place in the world that could use more critical thinking, it's online debates. So here's the online comment. I am a single mother, and when my daughter was little, I decided to go back to school to earn my nursing degree. I was in a tough situation financially, so I applied for food stamps. I used them for a time, but I got off them once I could earn a decent living. Most of these people today, though, on food stamps just want a free handout and they expect everyone else to take care of them. Notice the pattern here. She had to go on food stamps because she was in a tough situation. Circumstances dictate action. Other people, their actions, including going on food stamps, come from their basic character and wanting a free handout. So again, here's an old Peanuts cartoon that I like. Linus says, why are you always so anxious to criticize me? Lucy, I think I just have a knack for seeing other people's faults. Oh, what about your own faults? I have a knack for overlooking them. So the issue isn't just that we fault other people, but overlook faults in ourselves. There's a specific mechanism that lets us do this, really. We specifically say, my actions come from the environment and your actions come from your character. And some of this is self-serving. Some of this is also just a product of having our own perspective. We know the factors that go into our decision making, right? In the previous slide, the woman knows why she went on food stamps. She remembers the situation. So when you remember your particular circumstances, you think about the external stuff. On the other hand, when you think about other people, you don't know their situation as well because you're not in their situation. So you blame it on their character, the one thing that you do know. Okay. So next up is in-group bias. A lot of our discussion here will use the technical terms in-group and out-group. And these might be fairly self-explanatory, right? In-group just means us, out-group means them. And this allows us to talk generically about all sorts of divisions that come up between people, race, nationality, religion, ethnicity, gender, all these things, right? And so part of having an in-group and an out-group is bias against the out-group. That's straightforward prejudice, right? We don't like people of that other race. We don't like those foreigners. Straightforward prejudice, straightforward racism, it's easy to understand. There's a flip side to this that people tend to discount, and that's in-group bias, a general preference for other people who are members of the group we identify with. It's not so much that we hate them, it's just that we like us. Um, and so this could be a big factor, for instance, in employment discrimination. Oh, it's not that I disliked the minority candidate. I just hit it off so well with the candidate who was just like me. And we know this can lead to problems. I mean, obviously, economic injustice between races and other groups, but also just the fact that if you get a whole bunch of people together and they all think the same way, there are certain kinds of errors you can fall into. And having a diverse group of people can make you a better group of critical thinkers. So there's a quote here from Marilyn Brewer, a social psychologist that I like that Linker gives. Ultimately, many forms of discrimination and bias may not be because outgroups are hated, but because positive emotions such as admiration, sympathy, and trust are reserved for the in group. Okay, so there are two I want to cover at the same time because actually Linker has an example that hits both of them. One is group polarization. This is the way our beliefs and attitudes can become more extreme and more rigidified in the presence of members of our social group. So if you're together with a bunch of people who all you're in church, so you're all the same religion and you're all the same sect of the same religion. Actually, you'll start trying to one up each other on being, oh, the most Jesus or the most enlightened or whatever, right? The other is the outgroup homogeneity effect. Um, this is the tendency to see all the members of the outgroup as alike and interchangeable and even expendable, while viewing the in group as made up of diverse individuals. Um, so Linker illustrates these two with an online conversation that features two people who are extremely pro-gun and one person who is a gun skeptic, um, a skeptic of the ability to use guns to solve problems. And what happens is the two pro-gun people begin one-upping each other on how great they think guns are. Um, and as this happens, the other person gets more skeptical of them and specifically says, all you Second Amendment types are all the same, right? Um, so what's going on here? It's not just that, um, we polarize. There are factors driving polarization that are actually built into the way we think. So the outgroup homogeneity effect is pretty natural. Once again, just as a result of having a particular perspective. Um, you know your group really well. And you know all the people in it, and you know the differences between them. Often the fights that you have between members of your group get really heated um, because they're intimate, right? Meanwhile, you don't know much about the other guy, so they all start to seem the same. I saw a meme going around that said, um, uh, "People who turn right wing because they're annoyed by left wingers are weak. No one is more annoyed by left wingers than other left wingers." And I'm certain the same meme could be circulated on the other side as well, because of the outgroup homogeneity effect, and these factors that drive group polarization. All right, two more. False consensus bias. We often, if we're not contrasting our own group with an outgroup that we distrust, we tend to imagine that everyone is actually just like us. So, this is the cognitive bias that occurs when we overestimate how much people agree with our beliefs, values, opinions, preferences, how much their experiences are like ours. I find at LCCC, I encounter a lot of situations where people have very radically different levels of computer literacy. It's a factor that happens a lot at community college. And people just walk in, some people will walk in assuming that everyone is super computer literate because they grew up in a home with lots of computers. But not everyone lived that life, right? And so they're actually, things are different. So, we uh if we're not demonizing the other, we're just imagining everyone is the same as ourselves, and that also is a dangerous cognitive bias. Okay, the last term I have here isn't from Linker, but I wanted to introduce it as a general term that covers a lot of stuff that we've been covering, and this is identity protective cognition. So these are patterns of self-deception and faulty thinking that come from our need to preserve our self-understanding. So all the phenomena we saw around cognitive dissonance and trying to smother cognitive dissonance is driven by identity protective cognition. You need to protect your sense of self, which includes not admitting you're wrong or confronting a contradiction and just admitting that it's there and dealing with the dissonance. Um, um, so this is an umbrella category that covers a lot of the cognitive biases we see in this section. And it ultimately relates back to um, the web of belief and confirmation bias. Identity protective cognition is another factor that keeps the center of our web of belief strong. Okay, so that's it for this unit. We've got a practice test and then the real test, and then we're going to move on to social epistemology.